friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and every week I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of episode 5 and for the conclusion of Shark Week. If you are interested in Australian true crime and you love seeing lots of jump cuts, I live next to a train line, I'm really sorry about it, then consider hitting the subscribe button, or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. So, this is part 2 of the shark arm murder. If you haven't watched part 1, you should probably go back and give it a look, because a lot of this episode will make absolutely no sense to you if you don't. But if you want to start here, by all means go for it, you do you. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. Again, I'm not your real mum. But last week, we talked about Jim Smith's arm being vomited up by the tiger shark in the Coogee aquarium. It was then identified by his brother and his wife, and we went through Jim's background, including discovering some very shady business associates, mainly Paddy Brady, Reginald Holmes, and Albie Stannard. The murder mystery also involved another man named Watson, so there's literally people called Holmes and Watson in this case. We talked about smuggling and fraud that the men had participated in together, the sinking of the Pathfinder, as well as Detective Frank Matthews' association to the group, and where we left off is where Matthews finally decided, without any real evidence, to arrest Paddy Brady for the murder of Jim Smith. Him and his team took Paddy and later his wife Grace to the station, and they did this at about 6:30 p.m. on Thursday the 16th of May. Now this time of night was strategic. If they had arrested Paddy during the day, they would have had to take him to court to be charged, but because they didn't have enough evidence, they arrested him in the early evening so that they could keep him at the Criminal Investigation Bureau offices overnight, and hopefully wear him down with intense interrogation. The detectives took Paddy into Superintendent Pryor's office instead of an interview room and just made him sit there on his own for 2 hours, hoping that maybe the time by himself would impress upon him the seriousness and graveness of the situation. In the meantime, detectives had searched the Brady home and then had taken Grace separately to the CIB offices and into a room on the ground floor. She was kept comfortable while the interrogation of Paddy Brady began. Paddy at first actually asked for legal counsel, his lawyer Joe Lamaro of Lander and Lamaro Solicitors, but Detective Matthews ignored the request and instead told Paddy that they had Grace downstairs and that they were thinking about charging her with concealment of a crime. Now this made Paddy angry, and he told the detectives that Grace would never have had anything to do with any crime, and for the moment, his request for a lawyer was forgotten. Now, if Paddy was worried about how much information the detectives had on him, he did not show it. They asked if he knew Jim Smith, and he said he did know him, but he told them that he hadn't seen Jim since he'd come back from Tasmania. They informed Paddy that they had information that Jim had last been seen on April 8th in Paddy's company and hadn't been seen again until his arm was found at the aquarium. They told him that he was not obliged to answer any questions, but that if he did, anything he said would be used as evidence, and Paddy said he understood. But for the first part of the interview, Paddy continually denied that he'd ever even been in Cronulla and had no idea about a cottage there. They informed him that they had interviewed witnesses at the Hotel Cecil who confirmed that he was there with Jim Smith on the 8th of April, and Paddy still maintained that he had not seen Smith since coming back from Tasmania. The police then decided to bring his family into it. They had traced a money transfer from Paddy's brother Peter that was sent to a Mr. Williams in Cronulla, but had been picked up by Paddy at the Cronulla post office. They also had confirmed from many witnesses that Paddy was using the name Williams at the time. Paddy had definitely not been aware of how much the police actually knew about his movements, and this, as well as mention of more family that might be dragged into it, seemed to have struck a chord. Paddy finally admitted that he had been staying at the cottage that he had rented from Percy Alley until the 15th of April. They asked Paddy if there had been a trunk in the cottage when he had arrived, and Paddy confirmed that yes, there had been, and it was still there when he left. Detectives said that they actually had the information from Forbes, the owner, that the original trunk was gone when he had inspected the cottage after Paddy had left, and that a different one had been left in its place. Paddy said that he didn't know anything about that. He also claimed not to know anything about the missing rug or mats, or the missing anchor and rope. And he flat out refused to answer any questions surrounding his strange purchases of the mattress and the other trunk, or why he had travelled by taxi to Holmes's house on the morning of the 9th of April, the day after Jim Smith was last seen. After about 90 minutes, Matthews decided to finish the first interview and left Paddy in the office with Kalman. Matthews and Almond returned another hour and a half later, and Paddy announced that he'd been thinking it over. It was a serious matter, and he told them that he would not be left carrying the baby. They asked him what he meant by that, and he said that he'd read the newspaper articles and they were saying that Jim Smith had been murdered, so he was ready to give his statement. He wrote out his statement by hand, saying that Jim had indeed been to the cottage a few times, but that he'd seen Jim since the 8th of April. He said that on the 8th he was playing dominoes and drinking at the Cecil, and that he and Jim had gone back to the cottage and had some dinner. Jim had left at around 7:30 in the evening to go into town. He said that Jim had actually convinced him to join him and Reginald Holmes in the cheque fraud of Frank Carroll. He told detectives that he'd known Holmes for over a year, since the sinking of the Pathfinder. He had left the cottage in a hurry on the morning of the 9th of April to see Holmes regarding the details of the forgery of the cheque, and that afternoon he actually met back up with Jim in Hurstville before they both went back to the cottage. The next day, the 10th of April, he had left the cottage for a bit and he bought the trunk and mattress, although he still did not give an explanation for this at all. Then, when he got back, Jim was gone. He told detectives that that was the last time he ever saw Jim Smith, thinking that Jim would be back and they would meet up again the following day. Apart from putting the heat onto Reginald Holmes and providing a handwriting sample they could compare with the letter that was sent to Jim's son Raymond, it was nothing. There was no confession, no explanation of why he had bought any of the items at the second-hand store, or any indication that he had done anything to Jim Smith. Matthews was furious and decided that it was time to bring Grace into the mix to put a bit more pressure on Paddy. When Matthews left to fetch Grace, Detective Ullman told Paddy that they would let him go if he told them who killed Jim. But Paddy told him he didn't know and therefore couldn't tell them. Ullman asked if he would consider the offer, and Paddy said there was nothing to consider because he didn't have the answer. At about 1 a.m, Matthews brought Grace into the room and Paddy immediately rose to meet her, asking her if she was okay. She said she was, but she was still confused as to why they were even there. And when Paddy told her it was a murder charge, Grace actually fainted, and this made Paddy very angry. They decided to take Paddy to a ground floor room while Grace recovered, and then asked her if she wanted to make a statement. Grace, thinking that she could help her husband, decided to tell them everything she knew. Grace told detectives that on the 10th of April, Paddy had been at his sister's house in Kensington, and he was trying to patch things up with her after they'd argued at the Cecil. It took 2 days for Grace to finally give in, and on the 12th of April, they both went back to the cottage in Cronulla. When they got there and Grace entered the shack, she noticed that it looked like people had been there, and Paddy quickly shot back at her that he had definitely not been there, but that he hadn't been paying for it, and it was frequently used by the men who were paying the rent. The next morning, the 13th, Grace was angry to learn that Paddy had organised to meet up with someone at the Cecil, and he would be there a while. He had organised to take their young son Jack out fishing over the weekend, and Grace was going to go and pick him up, so she got on a bus, headed back to her mother's place to get Jack, figuring that Paddy would be back at the cottage by the time she and Jack arrived. That was the same day that Gladys's neighbour got the message that Jim Smith wouldn't be back until after the weekend. When Grace arrived with Jack back at the cottage later that afternoon, Paddy was still not back, and he did not turn up until the next morning. They had woken up to heavy rainfall on the morning of the 14th, and Paddy had walked in at about 9 a.m, soaking wet and bringing groceries. Grace was furious, but she loved her husband. She was not in a great mood and left her husband to his thoughts for the day, entertaining Jack while they were cooped up, unable to leave because of the rain. As it turned out, Paddy had gone back to Holmes's house on the 13th, and the taxi driver who had taken him there said that he did a strange thing. He asked for the interior light to be turned off, which was usually the indication that the taxi was occupied. He had gone from Holmes's house back to his sister's, and the next morning at 7:30 he had hired another taxi to take him to the Sea Breeze Hotel, where he was expecting to meet Holmes, but Holmes never showed up, and so he went back to the cottage to find his wife and child stuck inside and agitated both about Paddy's mysterious absences and about the weather. Grace told detectives that the next day, the 15th of April, the Brady family gathered up all of their belongings and moved out of the cottage, Grace having thoroughly cleaned it before they left. They went back to Grace's mother's house in Hurstville, where Grace and Jack had been living since Paddy moved to Tasmania. The weather started clearing up a few days later, and by the 17th of April, the weather was good enough for Bert Hobson and his nephew to go out fishing for their newest shark. 2 days before the arm would be regurgitated by the shark, on the 23rd of April, according to Grace's statement, Paddy told her that they were going to be moving to the other side of the harbour. They travelled by taxi to McMahon's Point in Lavender Bay, and Paddy told her to wait on a park bench while he went to see a man. When Paddy returned, he had a key and some money and told her that he'd gotten a flat for her. They walked a short distance to a small flat, and Paddy opened the door. Grace was less than enthused. She didn't know who this man was or why he would have just given them a flat and money, but she did know her husband, and it was bound to be bad news for them. The next morning, Grace had some words with her husband telling him that they were out of money, and Paddy replied that he'd get some. Grace heard him get on the phone and ask someone if the boss was in, and after a reply, he said, "Well, I'll catch him coming up." Grace and Paddy waited on the veranda, and when they saw the man coming up from the water, Paddy warned Grace not to be seen. Grace stayed out of the way, and Paddy came back into the flat shortly after with meat and more groceries. And later that same day, Paddy told her that he was going to see the man again, and he returned home with £3. 2 days later, on the 26th of April, Paddy was reading the morning paper, the one that had reported the discovery of the arm in the aquarium. He sat bolt upright and told Grace that he was going down the road. She watched him enter the man's house. When he came back a short time later, he handed £6 to Grace and told her that the man was going to Melbourne, so she'd need to make this bit of money last. Over the next few weeks, Grace told detectives she and Paddy moved houses another 3 times, ending up in the small ground floor flat where Paddy had eventually been arrested. It was now 2:30 in the morning, and the detectives, Paddy and Grace, were all exhausted. They had not gotten anything usable out of Paddy, and the detectives knew that they needed more time. They didn't have enough to charge him with the murder, and they wouldn't be able to hold him if there were no charges being laid. They decided that their best bet would be to hit him with a minor forgery charge for a cheque that he'd tried to cash almost a year beforehand. Paddy was put in custody to await the magistrate later that morning. They just needed to hold him. They needed more time to make inquiries, conduct more interviews, and hopefully get something concrete so they could charge Paddy with the murder of Jim Smith. Grace was told that the detectives would take her home, but she refused. She would stay at the CIB to be close to her husband. The next morning, in front of the magistrate, Paddy's bail was set at an unusually high £300, so he was taken back to the cells until his family could raise the money. Matthews and Almond knew that eventually the family would get the bail together, so they needed to work quickly. They travelled to Lavender Bay to speak to Reginald Holmes. Back at the CIB offices, Holmes told them that he hadn't seen much of Jim since the Pathfinder had sunk, and that he definitely hadn't seen him at all during 1935. When Holmes was shown Paddy's statement naming him as a suspect and as a participant in the fraud against Frank Carroll, Holmes denied all of it. They then brought Paddy into the room. Paddy identified Holmes as Mr. Reginald Holmes, the man he'd mentioned in his statement, and then they asked Holmes if he knew the man in front of him, and Holmes said, "No, I don't know him." No one was really expecting Holmes to blatantly lie, but that's what he did. When Matthews asked Holmes if he would like to make a statement, Holmes agreed, but he was now white as a sheet, shaking and anxious. His statement covered the building of the blocks of flats, which is how he first met Jim, but of course it didn't mention anything about how it was all a big scam. It covered the fact that Smith had been hired to caretake the Pathfinder and that the boat had been sunk. He said that he'd seen Smith a number of times after that, but that he didn't think he'd seen him at all during 1935. And he also said that he was shown a statement that was made mentioning his name and was confronted by a man that he didn't know and that he'd never seen before to his knowledge, referring, of course, to Paddy Brady. He continued to say that he had never seen this man before in his life, and this man had definitely never visited either his shipyard or his home. He said that he'd never discussed with this unknown man a check for Mr. Frank Carroll, and he knew no reason why this man would have ever mentioned his name. Matthews then had Holmes sign the statement, and it was said that his hand was shaking so violently that he could barely write. But he managed to sign it, and then he was allowed to return home. Later that day, detectives Matthews, Almond and Kelman were taking Paddy to the locations where he'd bought the trunk and the mattress. They also took him to the cottage to see if they could rattle him by showing him the boat that was out in the bay dragging the sea floor to find the original trunk. They were confident the trunk wouldn't be too far from the cottage, but they were disappointed when Paddy didn't seem concerned at all. He actually seemed to find it funny and commented that it must be an expensive exercise. The detectives knew they weren't getting anywhere, and they returned Paddy to the cells at the Central Police Station. Then they met up with Superintendent Silent Bill Pryor and tried to work out what their next move would be. They only had circumstantial evidence against Paddy Brady, and they didn't have a body. Paddy was the last one to see Jim alive, and he had mysteriously bought the trunk and mattress, and they couldn't think of another reason to do so unless it was to try and cover up the murder. However, they had no clear motive. Paddy had also suggested that Holmes was involved, but they couldn't figure out how. Almond was sure that in the time Paddy had been remanded, that he would be trying to figure out explanations for his movement to create reasonable doubt. And Almond was also thinking about the other possibilities. Was Holmes or Stannard involved? Did they give orders to have Jim bumped off, as Jim said they had, because they found out that Jim was an informant, and he had so much dirt on the two businessmen? But Matthews refused to even consider the possibility that this crime was not committed by Paddy Brady. Matthews thought that the only way to break Paddy is if they actually charged him for murder. And if they didn't, they would lose access to him. Paddy's family would surely come up with the bail soon, and Paddy would most likely go straight to his lawyers, so it was now or never in Matthews' mind. At 7:15 that evening, with Pryor's agreement, they brought Paddy up from the cells and informed him that they had decided to charge him with the murder of Jim Smith. The next step for Matthews and Almond was to go straight to the residence of Reginald Holmes, to try and put more pressure on him by telling him that Paddy had been charged. Both Reginald Holmes and his wife Innie maintained that they didn't know this man or anything about a cottage in Cronulla, but the detectives sensed that this was a lie, and they left knowing that they had scared the Holmes, and hopefully that would be enough to get them to cooperate. On Saturday the 18th of May at 7 p.m, Paddy requested to see Detective Matthews. He told the other detectives that he wanted to tell them everything from the time he hired the cottage until the time he was arrested. They took him to the CIB and he told Matthews that he would make his statement as long as he wasn't interrupted, and Matthews agreed. He told the eager detectives that he had been with Jim at the Cecil on the afternoon of the 8th of April, and Jim told him he was expecting company. When no one turned up, Jim called Holmes using the hotel's phone. When he came back, he told Paddy that both Holmes and Greg Vaughan would be coming by later that evening. They continued drinking at the hotel and played dominoes with the two other men. They left the bar at about 6 p.m. and went to the wharf to take the launch back to the cottage. They had some more beer and a cup of tea, had something to eat, and chatted for about 45 minutes. At 7:15 p.m, someone had called into the cottage from outside to Jim. Jim went out onto the steps for a few minutes, and when he came back, Paddy had asked who had been there. Jim had said it was only Stannard and one of Stannard's mates, but that Jim wouldn't be staying at the cottage after all. He'd be going back into town with Stannard and the other man. Jim told Paddy that he would most likely be back the next day. Paddy read a book at the cottage for a while, and at 8 p.m, Holmes had entered the cottage. When Holmes asked where Jim was, Paddy told him that he'd just left with Stannard and some other guy. Holmes asked how long they had been there, and Paddy answered that they didn't stay long and they didn't come into the shack. They were only there for about 6 or 7 minutes. Paddy told detectives that Reginald Holmes had then started talking about the cheque that they were organising to forge. Holmes then asked if Paddy thought Jim and Stannard and the other man would be coming back, and Paddy told him that he didn't think so. Jim said he probably wouldn't be back until the next day. So Holmes decided that he would go home, as that's probably where Stannard and Jim were headed anyway. Paddy said that he thought he might as well go back into town too, so he got a lift in with Holmes. Paddy told detectives that Holmes had dropped him off at the Redfern train station, where he spent the next little while going from pub to pub trying to get some beer. The cut-off time for that was usually 6 p.m, but he knew a few people and ended up getting a couple of bottles from someone he knew at a hotel. He then headed back to the cottage, taking the train and a bus. He got back at about 11 p.m, but when he walked in, he noticed a set of keys that he recognised as Holmes's. He said he rang Holmes early the next morning at about 7 a.m. about the keys, and Holmes said to bring them to him right away, as quickly as he could. And that's why Paddy was in such a rush so early on the 9th of April to get back into the city. Paddy said he got back to the cottage by taxi at about 9:30 a.m. He took the launch out, he bought some meat from the butcher, and he made himself some breakfast. Jim had still not come back, so Paddy decided to go back into town and have some more drinks. He was on his way back waiting for a train at Arncliffe Station when who should be on that exact train but Jim Smith. They chatted for a bit, and Jim told Paddy that he'd ended up in town the previous night, but gave no more information. Paddy told detectives that they bought some bread and cold meats in Cronulla and went back to the cottage for something to eat, and then decided to go for a drink at the hotel. Jim had let Paddy know that there might be a few people at the cottage later that evening, and Paddy decided that he would not hang around. He left Jim in Cronulla and had gone back to Sydney, and that was the last time he'd ever seen Jim Smith. The police knew about a couple more taxi rides that Paddy had taken that evening while he was staying with his sister, waiting for Grace to forgive him for the argument they'd had at the Cecil. He had ordered a taxi to Reg Holmes's house at 7 p.m. Paddy said he had gone there to discuss the cheque forgery, but that Holmes wasn't there when he arrived. He waited, chatting to Reg's wife Innie for a while, until Holmes returned at about 10:45 p.m, and Holmes told Paddy that he'd been at the cottage on some business. Paddy had asked if Jim had been there, and Holmes said no, but quickly changed the subject. Paddy and Holmes went up to the office, and Paddy practiced Frank Carroll's signature for a while until they were both happy. Paddy then told police that Holmes had handed him a £5 note and told him that he needed Paddy to buy some things for him. He needed him to buy a single mattress and a large tin trunk. Paddy asked him why he needed the trunk, and Holmes had told him that he wanted to store some of the old stuff in it that they had taken off the Pathfinder before it had sunk. The next day he had called the taxi and stopped at the stores to buy the items, and when he got back to the cottage, he noticed that the mattress had gone, and so had the trunk that had been there originally. He could see that people had been there. There were some empty beer bottles, some cups, and 4 glasses were out on the table. He called Holmes to report on the trunk and mattress. He then went out on the launch for a bit and then headed back to the cottage to catch the taxi that he had McGowan order for him for the afternoon. Once he managed to catch up with the cab, he went back to Holmes's house and worked once more on the cheque. Holmes then informed Paddy that he was going to be leaving for Melbourne shortly and that the cheque business might need to wait. Detective Matthews interrupted just once to ask if Paddy knew who had been at the cottage on the Tuesday night, and Paddy told him that he didn't know, except for Holmes. Holmes had definitely been there, but he wasn't sure who else. Paddy went on to say that on the 26th of April, after he'd read the newspaper article about the arm and saw the picture of the tattoo, he went straight to Holmes's house and showed him the article. He said to Holmes that he knew that he'd been at the cottage and asked if he had anything to do with it. Holmes said that he didn't and that it wasn't even Smith. He told Paddy not to take any notice of it. Paddy told him that he was worried. People knew that he had spent time at the cottage with Jim and that he was likely to be questioned about it. And once again, Holmes had said it wasn't Jim Smith and not to worry. He had gone back to Holmes's house later that day after reading another article in a different paper. Paddy told Holmes that he knew it was Jim, and Holmes yet again denied it. He told Paddy to go back to Tasmania if he was so worried about it. Paddy was freaking out about being the last person to be seen with Jim, and Holmes told him that he was taking it too seriously. Paddy asked Holmes what he was going to do, and Holmes said he was going to Melbourne. He again tried to convince Paddy to go to Tasmania, but Paddy refused to run. He told Holmes that if the police asked if they knew each other, Paddy would tell the truth. He said that the last time he rang Holmes was on the 15th of May, and Holmes said that he was going to be away and to ring him the following Tuesday, but the next day Paddy had been arrested. The detectives had been making shorthand notes the entire time, and when Paddy had finished, they asked him to sign the pages. Paddy declined because he didn't read shorthand, and he was not going to sign a document that he couldn't read. While Paddy was giving his statement, Holmes's mental stability was deteriorating rapidly. On Monday morning, a launch driver that worked for Stannard noticed Holmes standing in the window of his house. Holmes called out to him and asked how the boat was going, and Haas, the boat driver, asked if he wanted to take it out. Holmes said that he did. Haas started to get the boat in the water and told Holmes that it was low on oil, so they'd have to go over to Stannard's wharves to fill it up. Holmes stayed on the boat while Haas filled up the oil, and then Haas cast off. Haas went about his work, and he watched Holmes head off towards the harbour. Holmes took the boat east towards Point Piper. He took out and drank the rest of the brandy that was in the bottle he had brought with him, and he then took out a revolver from his coat pocket. With the residents of the point looking on, he pointed the barrel of the revolver at his own forehead, and he pulled the trigger. The force of the bullet threw Holmes overboard, but the cold water revived him. He grabbed the rope and he clambered back into the boat. His attempt at suicide had failed, and the bullet had been flattened against his skull and had failed to go through the bone. At around 7:45 a.m, Haas was working on the wharves, and he saw the boat that he'd given to Holmes, with Holmes slumped over the wheel. He took his own boat closer and boarded the launch, and was shocked to see Holmes with blood all over him and a bullet lodged in his forehead. He looked as if he was about to pass out, but he managed to ask Haas where Stannard was. Haas towed Holmes's boat back to Stannard's wharf, and Stannard came out asking what had happened. Holmes tried to speak, but he was unable to form words, and he quickly lost consciousness. Haas was very surprised when, instead of trying to get his friend out of the boat and to the hospital, Stannard just told him to tow Holmes and the launch to the water police headquarters. On the way, Holmes came to and he lost it when he was informed that they were going to the police. He took the wheel and swung the boat around, saying he was fine. Haas was not about it, and he told Holmes that if this was how he was going to act, then he could drop Haas off at the nearest wharf. And Holmes did. Haas headed back to Stannard's Wharf and immediately informed the police about what was happening on the water. The water police launched a powerful speedboat and started pursuing Holmes. Holmes's boating instincts kicked in and he led the police on a 4-hour chase on the harbour, almost ramming the police boat a few times. Detectives Matthews and Almond had been notified of what was happening on the harbour, and they also launched a slower boat to try and engage Holmes. Holmes was running out of fuel, figuratively and literally, and when Matthews and Almond came upon his vessel, he had slowed down, and his brother Leslie, who had also gone out on his boat, managed to climb aboard the launch and grabbed the keys. He saw his brother with the gaping wound in his head, dried blood all over his face and hair. As the police restrained Holmes and started taking him back to the wharves, he was heard saying, "Jim Smith is dead, and there is only one left. If you leave me until tonight, I will finish him." Matthews recognised that Holmes was in a vulnerable position, so instead of taking him to the hospital, they took him straight to the CIB, after the man had shot himself in the head. I mean, like Matthews, I know you want to solve the case, but the man literally still had the bullet in his head. He was given dry clothes and treated by the prison doctor, but he was not talking, and after 3 hours, he was taken to the hospital to finally have the bullet removed from his forehead. The detectives took this opportunity to go to the Holmes' house and search it and talk to his wife, Innie. After informing her that her husband was safe and in hospital, they searched the house and they actually found the £622 cheque that Paddy had mentioned in his statement, which meant that at least some of what Paddy had stated had been true. Some of the detectives questioned whether more of his story could be true, but Matthews was not having it. Paddy was guilty and he was going to prove it. As they searched the home, they got word that Holmes had been released from hospital and that he had finally agreed to talk. At the CIB, Holmes confirmed to detectives that Paddy Brady had come to his home on the morning of the 9th of April and had revealed to him that he had killed Jim Smith after a fight the previous evening. When Paddy came back to Holmes's house later that night, he had brought with him the brown leather bag, and to Holmes's horror, he pulled out of it Jim Smith's left arm, holding it by the rope that was tied around the wrist. Now, Holmes was not agreeing to make a statement, he was just agreeing to inform police of what he knew, so they still had a lot of work to do to gain his trust and make him their star witness. He met with investigators a few more times over the week, and Matthews seemed to develop a really good relationship with him. But it was obvious to anyone who knew Holmes that he was now working with the police, and that might get him into trouble, so Matthews asked him if he wanted any police protection. Holmes had refused, and even though Matthews had the means and the manpower to have some officers watch his home and workplace, Matthews didn't give the order, an action he would later regret. Holmes told investigators that he had never been to the cottage that Paddy had rented, and they wanted to make sure that this claim was above scrutiny, so they asked if he would be willing to go there. He agreed. Once inside, detectives kept their distance as they watched Holmes move through the residence. Matthews wouldn't hear of it when the other officers thought that Reginald Holmes seemed very familiar with the layout of the place. After the tour of the cottage, Holmes surprised detectives by telling them that he'd changed his mind and he would give them a formal statement. He would be their witness. According to Holmes, Paddy Brady had been continuously blackmailing him for over a year. It had all started when Paddy had arrived at his house in 1934, the day after Jim and Gladys had, and Holmes had found out that Jim was an informant. He had given Paddy the £40 thinking that Paddy would leave to Tasmania and that would be the end of it. But Paddy had contacted him when he had arrived back in early 1935 and began once again to threaten Holmes with the information he had on him, and Holmes began to give him small amounts of money fairly regularly, a few pounds at a time. which it seems was how Paddy was paying for the cottage and launch in Cronulla. Paddy had come to his home on the morning of the 9th of April and told him that he'd done away with Jim, and he said that if Holmes said a word that he would be done for too, and if Paddy couldn't get to him himself, he'd have one of his mates do it. He told Holmes that he had dumped the body outside Port Hacking inside the tin trunk, the one that Paddy had replaced. Paddy had said it might even be better that Holmes knew everything, because if any of it came out, Paddy would know it had been Holmes that told. He told detectives that a couple of weeks later, Paddy had been to see him asking for money and a place to stay. Holmes was this mystery man that Grace had heard of and seen a few times, who was providing Paddy with meat, groceries, and a few pounds here and there. Holmes said that once Paddy moved closer to his house, the blackmail escalated. He was scared for his own life. Paddy had proven, by telling him about Jim and showing him Jim's arm, that he was not a man to be messed with. He was so scared, in fact, that when he'd been brought to the CIB, he had denied knowing Paddy Brady. He signed this second statement and once again confirmed that he would testify in court. The next morning, Paddy had been transferred from the Long Bay Jail to the Central Police Station. Outside of his cell, Ullman told him casually that Holmes had talked and that he'd signed a statement saying that Paddy had confessed to the murder of Jim Smith. What happened next is referred to as the cell door incident. Paddy had asked to see the statement, and Ullman had handed it to him through the bars of his cell door. And at the door of his cell, with Detective Kalman watching on, Paddy started to read. According to the detectives, as he did this, his face went white and he became quite distressed. And when Paddy had finished, he handed the statement back and he had said, "That's all right. Is that all he said?" These words, coupled with his intense reaction at the statement, made the detectives fairly confident that what was written on the page was true. Meanwhile, the city coroner, Edward Thompson Oram, had been called to make a finding on the case of death. Considering the forensic evidence concerning the arm suggested that Jim Smith had been murdered. He had received a report from the detectives with the mostly circumstantial evidence in late May, but ruled that he could not make a judgment, so he called for an inquest. The inquest into Jim Smith's death was held on the 12th of June 1935. The detective team had been searching the water beyond the cottage for the last few weeks. They had used ropes with grappling hooks, and when that had not uncovered anything, they had hired a trawler with a chain system that had hooks every metre, but they still had not successfully recovered the tin trunk that Matthews was sure was lying on the bottom of the bay. Between the time of Holmes' attempted suicide and the inquest into the death of Jim Smith, Stannard had been visiting the Holmes' house regularly, providing support and comfort to Holmes, who seemed to be mentally unravelling. Holmes's wife had said that he seemed frightened and was scared that he may be a target for those that knew he'd made a statement to police and was due to be a witness against Paddy Brady. The day before the inquest, the police were busy gathering their evidence and sending out subpoenas for witness statements. Holmes had been in bed most of the morning, sinking further into depression, and had been drinking steadily. He had arranged some appointments for later in the day with Stannard and his barrister, who would be protecting him throughout the inquest. He arrived at Stannard's office for their 2 p.m. meeting, but Stannard's company secretary, Bernard Cahill, told him that Stannard was still at lunch. Holmes asked Cahill to sit in the car with him while they waited for Stannard to come back, and Cahill obliged. Cahill asked how Holmes was doing. After all, he'd last seen the man on Sydney Harbour with a bullet in his head. Holmes replied that he'd been talking to the CIB, and if everything went the way that he thought, then he or his family were bound to be bumped off. Stannard returned then, and Cahill went back to the office, leaving the 2 men in the car. They spoke for about 10 minutes, and then Holmes left. Holmes then met with his barrister, who told him that even though he was being brought in as a witness, it may end up that charges were laid for him as an accessory to the murder if the coroner committed him to trial. He also told Holmes that since the barrister had agreed to represent him, he'd been receiving death threats. This distressed Holmes even further. He left the barrister and drove right back to Stannard's office. He pulled up outside the office at about 5 p.m. and Stannard stood speaking with him through the window for a while when another car pulled up and two men got out, Norman Mulcahy and Sammy Berg. They were both casually employed by Stannard for odd jobs, and they got into Holmes's car to speak with him, but they only stayed a few minutes before getting back into their own vehicle. A patrolling officer, Constable Windred, had seen this encounter and knew all four of the men. Nothing seemed to be wrong, so he simply waved to Stannard as he passed, and Stannard waved back, and the constable went on his way. Stannard and Holmes spoke for a few minutes more before Holmes left, and Stannard went with his secretary to the first and last hotel, where he met back up with Mulcahy and Berg, and they were also joined by another man named Jack Strong. Holmes arrived back home at about 6 o'clock, but told Innie that he would be going out again that night. He told her not to worry and that he'd be home by about 9:30. He left at about 8 p.m. but wouldn't tell her where he was going or who he was meeting. When he had not returned by midnight, Innie began to frantically worry. She called Stannard, asking if he knew where Holmes was, and Stannard told her he had no idea. Innie thought Stannard might know, considering they'd only seen each other earlier that day, and Stannard told her he hadn't seen Reg since 2 p.m, which wasn't true. At 1:30 in the morning, Innie finally called the police, and when she received a call back, it wasn't Matthews or Almond as she'd been hoping. It was a sergeant at another police station who coldly informed her that her husband was dead, that he'd been found shot in a car by the city. Half an hour beforehand, Constable Harold Casey had been driving his patrol car when he'd seen a vehicle parked near the Hickson steps. The headlights were on and he could see the driver slumped over the steering wheel. He assumed the driver was asleep, so he stopped, got out, opened the unknown car's passenger door, and then shone his torchlight over the driver, where he noticed blood. Casey tried to find a pulse, but there was none. Reginald Holmes was dead, killed by gunshot wounds that were not self-inflicted. Detectives Matthews and Almond at this time had been informed of the death of Holmes, and after visiting the crime scene they went to the Holmes' residence, finding Innie Holmes, Albie Stannard and his wife, Innie's neighbour Eileen Cobb, and a few others already there trying to comfort the grieving widow. They asked Stannard when he'd last seen Holmes, to which Stannard claimed again that it was 2 p.m. the previous day, which again was a lie. Stannard then blurted out without a breath that he and his wife had been at the theatre from 7 p.m. till 10:30. Detectives had never asked his whereabouts, and usually it was only a guilty party that just offered up an alibi completely unprompted. This caused some suspicion of Stannard, but right now detectives had bigger problems. The inquest into Jim Smith's death would start in a few hours, and the only person that could testify that Brady had said he'd done it was dead. Their case was falling apart. The inquest was due to begin at 10 a.m. The police now not only had to deal with that, but also had to investigate the murder of Reginald Holmes. They were already suspicious of Stannard, and this suspicion only grew when they were contacted by Constable Windred, who told them that he had seen Holmes, Stannard, Mulcahy and Berg all together outside Stannard's offices after 5 p.m. that evening. In the couple of hours before the inquest began, the crowd outside the coroner's court was huge, and as there was no back entrance to the court, all of the witnesses had to enter through the main doors. But as well as reporters, there was a group of men who stood outside the doors and stayed very silent. Witnesses, including Jim's widow Gladys, reported being very fearful of the silent men, who it was said was there to intimidate and pass on threats to those willing to speak in court. In the last few weeks, a few men who had worked for Holmes and Stannard and were known to be informants, including Sid Murray, the man originally supposed to scuttle the Pathfinder, had been beaten and threatened ruthlessly in order to scare them into silence. When the inquest began, the court was packed with public spectators and reporters. Paddy was represented by Clive Evatt, and Evatt was assisted by Paddy's lawyers from Lander and Lamaro. From the moment that Coroner Oram began, Evatt was arguing the legality of the entire inquest. He quoted the Coroner's Act of 1912 and stated that the entire basis of a coroner's court inquest was the existence of a body, and there was no body, so how could an inquest proceed? He even went on to say that the coroner had no jurisdiction, as there'd been no post-mortem completed because there was no body to do it on. He stated that there would still be a reasonable question of whether Jim Smith was even dead. Oram responded that he had decided to hold the inquest based on the reports he had received, and then denied Evatt access to those reports. Evatt was fuming, but the inquest proceeded and Gladys Smith was called to the stand. Gladys told the court about her husband's background, his previous business dealings, and about the man she knew as Anderson or Evans, who her husband had told her was a master forger. When asked if she could identify the man, she pointed to Paddy Brady. Gladys continued, telling the court about the confrontation that Jim had had with Paddy Brady and Stanley Watson, and how Watson had threatened to shoot him. She spoke about the forged letter that had been sent to her son, and finally about the arm being discovered in the aquarium and the identification. On Evatt's cross-examination, he asked Gladys to describe the relationship between her husband and Paddy Brady, and on this, Evatt won some points. Gladys explained that Jim and Paddy were very friendly, and she had never seen anything to make her think otherwise. After hearing the next witnesses, Detective Head, who'd been called to the aquarium, and Detective Ewing, who had confirmed the fingerprint match, Coroner Oram adjourned the inquest for the day, and it was scheduled to continue at 10 a.m. That same afternoon, though, a man named Oliver Summers had read the article in the Sun newspaper about the murder of Reginald Holmes, and at 6:30 that night he went to the police station and told them that he had been in the vicinity of the Hickson Steps the night of the murder. He recalled hearing sounds that resembled gunshots, and he had seen a man hurrying past the bottom of the steps shortly after that. The man had looked up, and Summers said that he would remember the man's face. A meeting was arranged between Summers and Superintendent Pryor for the next morning. When they met the following day, Pryor had brought Matthews and Almond with him, and Oliver Summers detailed what he had seen and heard 3 days beforehand. They were very pleased to have a witness, and they were satisfied with the account he gave of what had happened that night. On the way back to the CIB, Almond made a pit stop at Stannard's office. Stannard was not there, but Bernard Cahill, the company's secretary, was. Cahill told Almond again that the last time he had seen Holmes was at 2 p.m. the afternoon before he was found dead. Almond casually told Cahill that, well, there must be some mistake, because Constable Windred reported seeing Holmes and Stannard with 2 other men just after 5 that day. Cahill was silent for a while before finally telling Almond that he was sorry and that he had lied, and that he had seen Holmes that evening at around 5 p.m. Almond went back to the CIB and reported this to Matthews and Pryor, and all 3 decided that they would bring Stannard in for a chat. Stannard arrived with his lawyer, and on his lawyer's advice he revealed that he had met with Holmes on that Tuesday evening. He told them he was so distressed about his friend's murder that he had simply forgotten. When asked what they had spoken about, Stannard told them nothing in particular, and denied that they'd ever discussed Paddy Brady or the inquest. When they asked him about when he'd last seen Mulcahy and Berg, Stannard told them that he'd met up with them and another man named Jack at the First and Last Hotel at about 5:20 p.m. The detectives once again knew he was lying, as Constable Windred had seen all 4 of them at Stannard's offices. By now, detectives were fairly confident that Stannard had something to do with Holmes's death. At 10 a.m. the same day, the inquest into Jim Smith's death resumed. Dr. Palmer, the medical examiner, was called as the first witness and told the court about his examination of the arm, and for the first time the public were told that the arm was cut off in a circular motion by something sharp, like a knife, and had not, as the papers had indicated, been bitten off by the shark. Dr. Palmer said that it was his belief that the arm had come from a person that was dead, due to the lack of effusion of blood into the surrounding tissue at the shoulder joint where it had been removed. The next witnesses were those that had last seen Jim Smith, some of his business associates, and Harry Levi, the barman at the Hotel Cecil. Levi told the court that he had seen the two men last on the 8th of April and had seen neither of them again until today when he saw Paddy Brady. He told the court when questioned by Evatt that Jim and Paddy, as far as he could see, were the best of friends. Edward Smith was called, Jim Smith's brother, and he told the court that he was supposed to go on the fishing trip, but that his brother had never contacted him, which was unusual as they were very close and that was very unlike Jim. Edward had also told officers privately that he had been threatened by the men outside the courtroom, the silent witnesses that had taken to standing in front of the entrance for every day of the inquest, and he had requested police protection. At 10 a.m. the next morning, the inquest continued, and witnesses that were brought forward included Percy Forbes, the owner of the cottage. He explained how he had gone to the cottage after Paddy had moved out and found that it had been meticulously cleaned. He spoke about the missing tin trunk and the missing rug and mats. He also spoke about the missing rope and anchor, and when shown the rope that had been tied around Jim Smith's wrists, he said to the court that this was definitely not the same as the anchor rope that Paddy had told him he'd lost. The rope for the anchor would have been much thicker than the rope found on the arm. What struck onlookers in the media the most, though, was when Forbes described finding the kerosene tin, and when he'd taken the lid off, he noticed a very offensive smell. He looked in, and there seemed to be about 2 cupfuls of a thick red liquid that appeared to him to be blood. Evatt asked Forbes how Paddy had appeared when they had met, and Forbes said that he was very courteous and very friendly, and he'd also said that he'd witnessed Brady and his family, his wife, another woman, and a few young men having a lovely seaside holiday. Innie Holmes was then called as the next witness. She detailed how Paddy Brady had come to their home early on April 9th and had spoken with her husband, how he'd been carrying a brown leather bag, and when asked if she'd ever seen a similar one, she said yes, she had seen Jim Smith carrying a very similar bag in the past. When asked if her husband had ever discussed Jim Smith with her, she told the court, who were waiting with bated breath, that until last week he had not. But last week he told her that Paddy Brady had murdered him, put his body in the trunk, and thrown it into the sea. Evatt was furious. This was hearsay, and the man who had supposedly said it was dead, and now all of the newspaper reporters would write it into their stories. But Coroner Oram didn't agree and admitted the statement into evidence. Evatt decided to make a bold move and attempt to stop the inquest by challenging the coroner's jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, and he would also file contempt of court actions against the newspapers. The court was once again adjourned for the evening, and that same night Superintendent Pryor received a call. The person on the other end of the line said that he had information that he needed to give to Pryor about Reginald Holmes's murder, but that his identity would need to remain a secret. Pryor left his office and secretly met with the informant, only known as Number 17, and this person told Pryor that it was Norman Mulcahy, Sammy Berg, and Jack Strong who had killed Holmes, on Stannard's orders. The identity of this informant has never been revealed, but Number 17 would go on to send more information to detectives over the course of their investigation. The next day, Detectives Almond and Matthews decided to visit Innie Holmes at her house. They were surprised that she seemed to be intoxicated so early, but this seemed to also make her more open to speaking with them. Innie told them about the smuggling that her husband and Stannard had been involved in, and how they were angry at a man named Halverson, the same man that Jim Smith had been worried that they were going to kidnap and kill back in 1933. Innie said that Stannard had mentioned to Jim Smith that they should get rid of Halverson, and Jim offered up the name of Stanley Watson as the man who might be willing to do it. A trap had been set for Halverson, and Sid Murray was supposed to pick up Watson and Halverson. Watson was going to kill Halverson, and then Murray would drop Watson back off at the Holmes' house. The plan failed when Murray had never showed up. Innie also told them that Holmes and Stannard had plans to get rid of a couple of other men that were taking some of their smuggling business. After the failed sinking of the Pathfinder, she said that Stannard was regularly at their home and that Holmes and Stannard were always fighting, and that they were scared that they were going to be caught. But Stannard had not always come alone. He had often arrived with Norman Mulcahy, Sammy Berg, and Jack Strong. Her husband had told her after Jim Smith's arm was discovered that he was likely to get bumped off, and if anything happened to him, then Stannard should be good for a few £1,000s. When Innie, who was shocked at this, asked if he was suggesting blackmail, Holmes said that there were some very bad customers about and the money might be very handy for her. The detectives left and Matthews was consumed in his own thoughts. Things were starting to unravel for him, but he might be able to salvage his career and reputation if he could solve Reginald Holmes's murder. The inquest resumed on the following Monday. Everett announced to the coroner that he had made a Supreme Court request to have the inquest shut down, and that pending that decision, he would like an immediate adjournment. Oram denied this request and said that pending the Supreme Court's decision, the inquest would continue. The first witness on this day of the inquest was the other James Smith, who confirmed that Paddy Brady had hired his launch, and he also confirmed that the rope found around the arm of Jim Smith did not match the rope that was supplied on the boat. The next were the taxi drivers that had driven Paddy around on the 9th of April, and all of them agreed that seeing someone appear ragged, tired, unshaven, not properly dressed wasn't exactly unusual in their line of work. The next witness was Stannard. Stannard denied knowing Paddy Brady. He said he'd been home on the night Jim Smith was last seen and the 2 days following that. He said he'd never been to the Cronulla cottage, nor had he and Holmes discussed ever going there. Greg Vaughan was called as the next witness, and he denied ever organising a fishing trip. He also had not been to the Cronulla cottage, and he had no idea about any fraud concerning the Pathfinder. Everett questioned him about why he would buy a luxury yacht for so much money and then never use it, and Vaughan replied that he'd bought it for the purpose of speculation. Coroner Oram broke court for lunch, and when he went to his office, he found a notice requesting him at the Supreme Court the next morning to show cause as to why the inquest should proceed. Everett had succeeded. Oram came back into the courtroom and immediately adjourned the inquest indefinitely until a decision by the Supreme Court was made as to whether it could or should continue. The good news for Everett, his team, and Paddy kept coming. The editors of the local newspaper had also all been ordered to attend the Supreme Court to answer to the charges of contempt for printing hearsay. The Supreme Court Justice, after hearing Everett's arguments, said that the case against the inquest came down to one question: is an arm a body? He said that in some cases only fragments of a body remained, such as those that were burnt, and Everett said that while this may be adequate for a criminal court, the coroner's role differed in that the coroner must see a body and, having seen it, must declare that the person is dead. The justice, when handing down his verdict, said the question of how much of a body was required for an inquest had never come up in Australia before, but he found that the limb in this case could not be considered a body, and therefore there was no basis for the inquest, and that the coroner should have never opened it in the first place. The justice also found the newspaper editors in contempt of court, and they were given large fines in accordance with the ruling. Everett had proved just how formidable he was and how far he would go to protect his clients. By this time, some of the detective team, particularly Almond, were no longer sure that Paddy was guilty. Stannard and Holmes's actions seemed far shadier. They had more money and connections, and they had proven that they were capable of soliciting murder. But Matthews and Pryor, again under intense scrutiny over mounting unsolved murder cases, were determined to have Paddy Brady stand trial for the murder of Jim Smith. While detectives waited for a hearing date to be set, they doubled down on their investigation into Holmes's murder. They weren't having much luck though. The news about the shooting of Reginald Holmes had got around, and so had the warning that anyone else found working with the police would find themselves in a similar situation. The police knew that Sammy Berg, Norman Mulcahy and Jack Strong were involved, as well as Stannard, and they had pegged Jack Strong as their man. He was known around the wharves as the Master and was a hard man, an enforcer, and well known to Stannard, who had him working as a supervisor among other odd jobs. He was also well known to Detective John Brown of one of the local police stations, so Matthews had Brown wait until Strong had had a few drinks at his local, the AS&N Hotel, and bring him in later in the evening, the same tactic he'd used on Paddy Brady, giving police more time to question him before he had to be let go or charged. It was still early in the day when Pryor showed Matthews a note that had been delivered to him. It was from number 17, the secret informant. In this note he had told them that Stannard had driven Holmes to New Hickson Steps where he had the other men waiting. When Stannard had exited the car, 2 of the other men had rushed over and shot Holmes. It was either Strong or Berg. The note said that the informant would give them enough information to convict the group of men, but only if they were all arrested and locked in a cell. That afternoon, police had brought both Berg and Mulcahy to the station for questioning. Berg told detectives that he'd last seen Holmes at 5 p.m. on the 11th of June at Stannard's offices. He'd spoken to Holmes about a boat for a few minutes, and then he and Mulcahy had left just before 5:30 and went to the first and last hotel. They drank for a while with Stannard and Cahill, and then he and Mulcahy had driven to another hotel, the Ship Inn, and had a few more drinks. At 6 p.m. they went down to Haymarket and had some dinner, and after that they drove to a friend's house, Cocker Avery. They got there at about 6:45, but Cocker wasn't home. His wife was, though, and she had let them in. When Cocker Avery came home, they gave him some money and he went out and got some more alcohol. Berg and Mulcahy drank there until about 10:30 p.m, and then Mulcahy had dropped him back off at home at about 11. He told detectives that they did not leave Avery's home between arriving at 6:45 and leaving at 10:30. They questioned Mulcahy separately, and they were not surprised to find that the statement matched Berg's almost word for word. They both sounded coached and rehearsed. Detectives then went to the Avery home and confirmed the information that they'd been given, but they were fairly unconvinced by the answers given by both Cocker and his wife. They noticed the nerves and the sideways glances, and how Cocker would routinely answer questions for his wife, even when the question was directed at her. At 5 p.m, Detective Brown walked into the AS&N Hotel and told Jack Strong that he was wanted for questioning. Jack Strong gave an unexpected response. He said, "I'm glad it's over. I knew you'd be looking for me." Apparently he'd been drinking heavily since Holmes's murder. He told Brown that he'd been in Holmes's car the night of the murder and he knew that implicated him, but he had nothing to do with it. When they got to the CIB offices, Strong told detectives that he was headed to the AS&N from Lynch's hotel when a car almost ran him over, and he noticed that the driver was Reg Holmes. Holmes had offered him a ride to the hotel and he had accepted. Holmes had dropped him there just as the hotel was closing, at about 6 p.m. The detectives were already finding holes in Strong's story. The Lynch's hotel was about 100 metres from the AS&N, not really worth getting in a car over. So they asked Strong if he'd be willing to be fingerprinted, and he agreed. The fingerprints were quickly matched to some that had been taken from Holmes's car, but the prints on the car were on the inside upper door frame. There was no way that prints could have gotten there by simply opening the door and getting inside the vehicle or by exiting normally. When this was told to Strong, he said that he was drunk and he may have been standing there with the door open talking to Holmes for a while, but he couldn't remember. Detectives asked if he was sure that the hotel was closing when he arrived, and Strong said yes, he remembers the doors being closed. Matthews told Strong that Innie Holmes and her maid had confirmed that Holmes had arrived back at his house that evening at 10 to 6, and it would have taken him 10 minutes to get there. So how did Strong explain that? Strong said he didn't know, but he was positive that the hotel was closing. When asked if he had been to Hickson Road that night, Strong said that he may have. He was drunk, he didn't know. But he was adamant that he could never and would never shoot the man. He said that after he left the AS&N, he'd gone home. He spent some time talking with his Uncle Joe and a lodger that was staying at his house, and then he went to bed. The detectives went to Strong's home and spoke with his family. All of them confirmed that he was home before 7 and was asleep, as he'd said. But all of them also distrusted the police, and again, word had gotten around about what would happen to anyone that cooperated with detectives. Detectives were finding that no one in the area was willing to speak to them at all, so the next day they decided to advertise a £300 reward for any information leading to the arrest or conviction of anyone associated with the murder of Holmes. And if anyone was to come forward that happened to be an accomplice to the crime, as long as they were not the actual person to have pulled the trigger, they would receive a full pardon. More notes had arrived from number 17 after this announcement, one stating that Mrs. Avery was not telling the truth, that she was worried she would befall the same fate as Holmes if she were to speak up. The informant said that if they were to speak with her alone and put more pressure on her, she would probably crack. Pryor decided, though, that they would not do this, as they didn't want another victim on their hands. The second note informed police that Jack Strong had been with Berg and Mulcahy when they were at the Averys. The men had killed Holmes and then driven to the Averys' house and were using her as their alibi. A third note told Pryor that he needed to be careful with the information he was being given. There was now a lot of money at stake and information was leaking. Meanwhile, Oliver Summers had been given a police detail and a living allowance to keep him safe while police drove him around town, hoping that he would see the man he had seen the night of Reginald Holmes's murder. The detectives wanted to make sure that they at least spotted Stannard, Strong, Berg and Mulcahy, but they had to be careful not to influence Summers, or at least they had to be careful to make it look like they were not influencing him. At the same time, they had questioned another man named Walter Thomas, who had been sitting at his window the night of the murder. His apartment was above Hickson Road, and he had seen Holmes's car parked with the lights on and a man standing at the open passenger door, his hand resting on the frame. The man crouched down as if he was speaking to the driver, and then Thomas heard 3 shots ring out. The man stepped back from the door and crouched down in front of the car for a moment before walking off towards the harbour. While this seemed to match the detective's theory that Strong had stood holding the top of the door frame and that's how his prints had gotten there, it didn't exactly match what Summers had reported. The 2 witnesses had apparently seen the same man walk off in 2 different directions, and Summers had reported hearing the shots at just after 9, while Thomas had said he'd heard them at 9:30. Due to Walter Thomas's age and terrible stutter that he suffered from, the detectives put their faith in Summers, who said he would definitely be able to remember the man if he were to see him again. The detectives now wanted to look into Stannard's alibi, that he was at the cinema with his wife on the night of the murder. Stannard had said that he and his wife had seen the film Roberta, and both the ticket booth worker Lucy and the car park attendant both remembered them arriving. Lucy, who had worked at the picture theatre for 7 years and knew the couple well, had said it was very odd for them to be there on a Tuesday. They would usually see a Saturday picture. There were 2 other things that seemed odd. The first being that the week after Holmes's murder, both Stannard and his wife Enid had come back to the theatre to ask Lucy and the car park attendant Fred if they remembered the couple being there, making sure that they both clearly recalled Albie and his wife attending the film. The second being that Albie and Enid had arrived to see the film an hour after it had started. They watched the last 40 minutes, sat through the interval, and then watched the first hour of the next showing that started at 9:23. It was almost like they just needed somewhere to be for a couple of hours that was public, perhaps as an alibi. On the 3rd of July 1935, Paddy's committal hearing began. For all the circumstantial evidence that had been admitted and all of Everett's outbursts that none of it actually tied Paddy to anything, the magistrate's decision primarily took into account one thing. If Holmes's statement could still be considered now that the man who made it was dead. Magistrate Herbert McDougall confirmed it could be considered as a prima facie case, and the trial would go ahead. Prima facie meaning that it was committed to trial just based on first impressions. He was unsure if a jury would convict, but he decided that the jury would need to hear the evidence and decide that for themselves. Bail was set for Paddy Brady at £3,000, which today would be almost $300,000. Everett was not happy. Paddy had been remanded. He'd been kept in prison for almost 3 months already. But what he hadn't counted on was Paddy's sisters. His 3 sisters, the very next day, handed over the deeds to their homes along with some cash, and Paddy was able to go home, at least for a while. The trial was held on September 9th, 1935, and actually had the Chief Justice, Frederick Jordan, presiding. Paddy submitted his plea, not guilty. Justice Jordan then gave a warning to the jury. They must disregard anything they'd seen and heard up until this moment, and they were only to base their judgment on what came out at this trial. And that because the trial was only based on circumstantial evidence, that they had to come back with a verdict of either murder or nothing, and reminded them that a conviction could only be handed down if they were completely satisfied that there were no other reasonable explanations of Patrick Brady's actions other than his guilt. Justice Jordan also needed to rule on the admissibility of Holmes's statements. The magistrate had committed the trial based on them, but the call for whether they were admissible at the trial was up to Jordan. He dismissed the jury while he heard the police's case for admitting the statements. Detectives Almond and Kalman testified that when Paddy was shown the 2 statements that Holmes had made, Paddy had said the first one was all lies, the one where Holmes had denied ever knowing Paddy Brady. But the second one, the one that was called the cell door incident, was when Paddy had read the statement to himself. He had gone white, become shaky and nervous, and had said to detectives, "That's all right. Is that all he said?" Justice Jordan ruled that the words Paddy had used did not imply his guilt, nor did they imply that anything in the statement was true. He also said that the reaction the detectives had put so much weight on would be expected of someone who had just learnt that a friend had named him for murder. In a shocking blow to the detective's case, Justice Jordan refused to allow Holmes' statement as evidence. All of the witnesses that had spoken at the inquest returned to bear witness at the trial. None of the witnesses could add to what they had said at the inquest, and there was no physical evidence that Paddy had done anything to Jim Smith. There were some concerning actions, such as the trunk and the mattress and fleeing to Holmes's house the day after Jim was last seen, but no solid proof and plenty of reasonable doubt that this man had actually killed Smith. Everett's questions to the witnesses only further confirmed that Jim and Paddy had been close friends. After all the witnesses had spoken and the prosecution had no one left to call, Justice Jordan made the announcement to the jury that he had no other choice but to direct them to acquit, based on circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt. On the 10th of September 1935, the jury formally returned a not guilty verdict. Paddy's family in the back of the courtroom cried and hugged each other. Paddy had been cleared of the murder of his friend, but his relief only lasted a few minutes. He was then remanded on charges of forgery in Tasmania, the ones he'd previously ran away from, and was taken back to Hobart to face the music. The CIB had failed to get their conviction, and now all eyes were on them to make some progress on the Holmes murder. They had made little progress so far because no one in the community would speak to them. They were all scared, and they had reason to be. Many of Holmes and Stannard's old associates had ended up in hospital, some with broken bones. They wouldn't say how it had happened, but it was clear to police that these were warnings to stay quiet. 3 weeks before Paddy Brady's acquittal, however, Oliver Summers had been eating his lunch on a park bench in the Botanic Gardens when he saw a man exit the wharf building. He immediately headed for the CIB and told them that he'd seen this man, and he was sure it was the same one that he'd seen on Hickson Road the night of Holmes's murder. Detective Devereux McDermott took Oliver Summers later that day to the First and Last Hotel, and they waited outside, watching. A man came out of the hotel and got into a car, and Summers told McDermott that this was the man he'd seen at the Gardens and at Hickson Road. It was Albert Stannard. Matthews wrote a report to the Commissioner outlining their position. He said that after speaking with Innie Holmes and their other inquiries, that Holmes may have spoken with Stannard the day before he was killed about the evidence he was to give at the coronial inquest into the death of Jim Smith. Knowing that this would implicate Stannard and his workers, he thought Stannard had arranged the shooting. Strong was the likely suspect to have actually pulled the trigger, being an enforcer for Stannard over the years. Matthews said that Stannard had acted evasive and difficult during the interview process, and that all of the men's alibis were weak at best. In the middle of September, Coroner Oram had called detectives in to give their information on the death of Holmes, and once again, after failing to make a finding, he called for another coronial inquest. This guy just loves an inquest. At least this time he had a body. The inquest began on the 2nd of October and named Stannard and Strong as persons of interest. The group of men outside the courtroom were back, and Innie Holmes was once again called as a witness. She spoke about how Stannard and her husband had fought frequently after the failed Pathfinder insurance scam, and how Stannard had been removed by Holmes as executor of Holmes's estate. She also spoke about her husband attempting suicide previous to shooting himself, saying that he was taking stuff out of a bottle that Stannard had given him. Oliver Summers, the detective's star witness, confirmed in court that Stannard was the man he'd seen at Hickson Road walking away from Holmes's car after the shooting. The other witness, Walter Thompson, seemed to have completely changed his mind about seeing anyone walking away from the vehicle or at the vehicle that night, and another man who had also reported hearing the shots that night now said in court that after he heard the noises, he had stayed on fishing at the wharf and didn't see or hear anything else. It not only seemed like someone had gotten to these witnesses, it also created doubt around Summers' testimony. Jack Strong could still not find anyone who was willing to say they'd seen him at the ASN Hotel the night of the shooting, which was his alibi, and when asked how his fingerprints had gotten into the car, he said that he still couldn't remember, he'd been drunk. Stannard, when asked why he'd failed to mention his second meeting with Holmes, said he'd simply forgotten as he was so upset at the time. He admitted to the court, though, that he had loaned Holmes the money to buy the Pathfinder in exchange for one of Holmes's life insurance policies, and that after Holmes's murder, he'd actually claimed on it. When asked why he'd paid Jim Smith £150 after the Pathfinder sinking, Stannard said that Holmes had told him to. When pushed as to why he'd just hand over a relatively large sum of money without question or without knowing what it was for, Stannard simply replied that it did not interest him. Coroner Oram was satisfied with the information given at the inquest and found that Reginald Lloyd Holmes had come to his death by revolver shots in the abdomen inflicted by John Patrick Strong. He also found that Albert Stannard aided and abetted the crime, and so he committed both to stand trial for the murder on the 18th of November. On that Monday, Stannard and Strong arrived with their legal representation in front of a crowd of onlookers. The silent men, dressed in black, were once again crowded outside the courthouse. Stannard's defense attorney was Richard Windyer, and Strong had T.P. McMahon representing him. Windyer knew that his best bet was to discredit Summers, who had claimed he'd seen Stannard at Hickson Road, and to provide witnesses to the alibis of both Stannard and Strong. He started, though, by making a very smart argument that they could not allow any documents surrounding the Pathfinder sinking or Stannard and Holmes' business relationship to be admitted into this trial. These documents would suggest that Holmes had been killed because he was going to give evidence at the Smith inquest and Paddy Brady's trial, and if these documents were allowed, it would be necessary to prove that Holmes's testimony was important to that case. And because his statements had not been allowed at that trial, this could not be proven. The judge agreed, and so this trial would not be allowed to discuss anything relating to Stannard purchasing the Pathfinder or what he would have gained from the insurance claim, anything about Holmes and Stannard's crumbling friendship, or anything relating to Jim Smith's murder or disappearance, which was half the prosecutor's case. It was a crushing blow to the prosecution. They were counting on this being the motive, but they still had Summers, and he was a reliable witness, right? Well, over the course of the trial, Windeyer brought in 2 witnesses that had spoken with Summers after the event, and he had told them that he'd heard the shots and seen a man leaving, but that he'd not seen the man's face. He'd also said that if he could only identify the man, then he would get the reward and could return to England. They confirmed that Summers had been following a few men around, and all the men he'd chosen to follow all looked completely different. Windeyer also produced witnesses that had seen Summers hanging around Stannard's boat shed before the murder, even though Summers had told police that he'd never seen the man before and didn't know who he was. Windeyer also pointed out that Summers had claimed that he had found out about the murder in the newspaper the day after the death, but that a newspaper reporter had said that they'd spoken with Summers at 6 p.m. that evening before Summers had gone to the police. Summers denied this, but Windeyer had successfully made Summers out to be a fraud and a man caught up in wanting the reward or his 15 minutes of fame. Windeyer brought in witnesses to confirm Stannard's alibi, the ticket seller and the car park attendant from the theatre, who both confirmed that the couple arrived at 7 p.m. and that neither had seen them leave until 10:30. Enid Stannard, Albert's wife, had confirmed the same thing, and even at the interval, her husband hadn't left her side. She came across as a much more reliable witness than Summers at this point. Strong, throughout the inquest investigation, had complained a number of times that no one would confirm seeing him at the AS&N Hotel the night of the murder. But at this trial, he miraculously was able to get 2 witnesses to confirm under oath that they had seen Strong arrive at the hotel a few minutes before 6 p.m. and that he'd been talking to another man in a car. All of Strong's family were called to testify, and they all swore under oath that he'd been at home sleeping. Even those in the house that had said they were unsure when police had interviewed them now said with 100% certainty that he had been there. Other witnesses, including Innie Holmes's neighbour and Mrs. Dodd, the maid for the Holmes, both testified that Reg Holmes and Albie Stannard were great friends and that no 2 men were closer. Even Innie Holmes testified to this after what she'd said at the inquest. Both defence attorneys had done their jobs well. Their closing arguments were that Stannard was only guilty if the jury believed Summers' testimony, which now had been thrown into suspicion, and that Strong had provided a reasonable explanation as to why his prints would have been on Holmes's car, and that many witnesses had confirmed that he was nowhere near Hickson Road when the murder had occurred. The jury were directed by Justice Holst Rogers to deliberate. The trial had gone on for 8 days, and it came down to whether they believed Summers and whether they thought that Strong's fingerprints were put on the door at the time of the shooting, or if they could have been put there at any other time. The jury deliberated for 20 hours, and when they returned into the courtroom on the 26th of November, they informed the justice that they were hung. They could not agree, and there was no way they were going to. After this exhausting trial, there was still no result, and a new trial date was set for early December. The next trial lasted only 5 days, and the information was presented to a new jury. There was no change in testimony or statements of the witnesses, the prosecution or the defence. On the 4th day, the jury handed down Stannard's verdict: not guilty. The jury were not satisfied by Summers' identification of Stannard as being the man at Hickson Road, and this is what the entire conviction of Stannard rested on. He was free to go. The following day they deliberated on Strong's verdict: not guilty. Both men walked free. 2 days later, Matthew was required to write a report on the entire shark arm fiasco. Matthews wrote that there was no doubt in the mind of detectives that Paddy Brady murdered Jim Smith in Cronulla, and that if Holmes had lived, or if they'd been able to admit his statement, then they would have been able to convict him. He also wrote that there was no doubt that Strong had killed Holmes on Stannard's orders, and if they were able to get witnesses to actually give evidence in court that they had given confidentially to police, then both men would have been convicted of that crime. The commissioner signed the report, and that was that. The thing is, though, that the detective team, including Matthews, actually had real doubts about Paddy Brady's guilt. They knew that he had never participated in violent crime before, and that Holmes and Stannard had both tried to arrange other murders. And they also both knew that Jim was a police informant who'd been involved with their business of smuggling and fraud. Frank Matthews was named superintendent of the CIB in March of 1938, but he was still considered a loner by fellow officers, and he never really overcame the failure of the shark arm murder and the murder of Reginald Holmes. He retired in 1948. Albie Stannard continued his boat business in Sydney for another 15 years after being acquitted of Holmes's murder. He and his wife Enid moved to the United States in 1950, and Stannard ended up living to the age of 95, passing away in San Francisco in 1987. Patrick Brady continued to forge checks for most of his life. He remained married to Grace, but they lost their son Jack in World War II in 1944. Brady continued to profess his innocence in the murder of Jim Smith for the rest of his life, but he would also never break his silence about what had actually happened. He died in August of 1965 at the age of 72. Now, these men may never have been well known or infamous, and the death of Jim Smith may never have been a national sensation if it weren't for the 1 in a million chance that Bert Hobson and his nephew had gone fishing on that exact day and caught that exact shark, which just happened to be the one that had swallowed Jim Smith's arm. So I really want to hear your theories as to who you think did it and why. One of the books I read for research on this case is Shark Arm, A Shark, a Tattooed Arm, and Two Unsolved Murders by Philip Roop and Kevin Meagher, and there is so much more detail in it about the actions of Paddy, Stannard and Holmes, and they offer the theory that all of them had something to do with it, that Holmes and Stannard, mainly Stannard, afraid that Jim Smith was going to inform on them, arranged the murder, and that they scared Paddy Brady into helping them cover it up by leaving the arm in the cottage as a warning. And I kind of agree with them. Stannard was then so worried about what Holmes might have revealed in Smith's inquest and Paddy's trial that he arranged his friend's murder too. I mean, he was powerful enough, he had the manpower, he had plenty of men willing to do his bidding and enough money to pay them for it. So I definitely think he was the ringleader here. He pulled all of the strings, the puppet master, if you will. But that is the unsolved case of the shark arm murder. I know this was a long one, and thank you so much for your patience on me getting it all together. There was so much to this case, and I really wanted to give you everything. Again, if you're so inclined, let me know what you think happened in the comments below, and hopefully I will catch you guys on the next episode. But until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye!